On a cold April night in 1945, as the crumbling remains of the Third Reich collapsed under Allied bombardment, a quiet convoy of unmarked trucks rolled through the forests of Bavaria. Their engines were muted, their insignia hastily painted over. Witnesses described only shadows moving past the wreckage of abandoned towns, headed south under a veil of secrecy. Allied intelligence never recorded their passage. Soviet archives would later redact any mention of them. They called it Operation Eclipse, an event whispered among intelligence officers for decades as the war's final vanishing act, the moment when history itself seemed to erase evidence of what those trucks carried away. Chapter 1. The Ghost Convoy of Operation Eclipse. The story begins in the dying weeks of Nazi Germany, April 1945. Allied forces were advancing from the west, Soviet divisions from the east. In the Bavarian Alps, where scattered remnants of the Wehrmacht had retreated, a quiet directive emerged from the fragmented Reich command network. Buried within what was left of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht communications archive, a single order was transmitted on 23 April. Under the reference code Eclipse 045B, its sender was listed as Amt 6 F, the Foreign Intelligence Branch of the Reich Main Security Office RSHA. The message ordered the immediate evacuation of materials and personnel of Category Schwarz to a designated southern port. The language was ambiguous, deliberately encoded, but to trained analysts, it carried weight. Category Schwarz referred to projects under the highest wartime secrecy, often involving weapons prototypes, scientific archives, or industrial assets with strategic potential. By the time the Allies reached Munich, the command structure had disintegrated. Records show fragments of logistics entries from the 19th Army, noting requisitioned transport vehicles redirected south via Bad Tölz. The same date appears in a Soviet debrief transcript of a captured SS officer, Obersturmführer Hans Kluge, who stated under interrogation that a special convoy departed Garmisch-Partenkirchen carrying non-human cargo, guarded by foreign-speaking men, possibly not German. What they transported remains a mystery, but within Allied field reports, there is mention of 12 trucks painted matte grey, travelling with false unit markings of Kampfgruppe Steiner. After the war, Allied intelligence initiated hundreds of document seizures under Operation Paperclip and its British counterpart, Project Surgeon. Most focused on acquiring German scientists, but several files hint at unsanctioned transfers, rogue efforts to move materials beyond official oversight. In 1952, an MI6 report classified as ultra-restricted was filed under the title Residual Movements, April 1945. It referenced a convoy of unknown registration proceeding southward from Mittenwald with high-value cargo of strategic significance. The report noted that attempts to intercept failed due to geographic obstruction and conflicting jurisdiction between Allied zones. The final line, written in the margin by an unidentified analyst, reads simply, Eclipse assets presumed exfiltrated. The Genoa connection emerges from a secondary trail. Italian partisans recalled an unusual presence near the port in late April, days before the city's liberation. A local dock worker, Emilio Conti, gave a statement in 1946 describing trucks with German number plates, guarded by men in mixed uniforms, loading wooden crates into a ship under British flags. The vessel, according to his description, was a modified cargo ship named Argento, though no such ship appears in Allied naval registries. The British War Office denied any affiliation. Still, shipping manifests uncovered in 1981 by historian Dr. Lothar Eberhardt show an unlisted departure from Genoa on 2nd May 1945. Destination noted as Lisbon, diplomatic cargo, further complicating matters. Soviet archives include a brief memo from the GRU, dated 12th May 1945, referring to Eclipse transport units, possibly under corporate protection. The mention of corporate remains unexplained. Speculation later centered on industrial entities that collaborated with the Nazi war machine. Companies with interests in ensuring certain technologies or documents were not captured by the Soviets. Among them were AEG, IG Farben, and Krupp. Several of these corporations underwent aggressive denazification screenings, yet many internal files vanished in the post-war chaos. By 1949, whispers of Eclipse had reached Washington. A classified memorandum from the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, responsible for Paperclip, discusses an unverified report of independent exfiltration of German technical assets prior to surrender. The memo concludes with a curious line. If Eclipse existed, it functioned outside Reich authority, perhaps under industrial or foreign sponsorship. This statement has fueled decades of debate among military, historians and conspiracy theorists alike. The strongest physical trace of operation, Eclipse appeared briefly in 1971, when a cache of deteriorating documents was discovered in an abandoned tunnel near Innsbruck. Among the debris were fragments of transport manifests bearing the Reich Eagle watermark but lacking official stamps. One entry reads, Cargo, metallische Komponenten Typ A, sealed under SS custody, not to be opened before arrival. The rest of the page was charred, though the bottom line survived. Consignment for Objektenweiss, Genoa. The phrase Objektenweiss appears nowhere else in German wartime lexicon. When the British Ministry of Defence declassified several Cold War files in the 1990s, one curious entry resurfaced. A 1956 SIS intercept log mentioned an Italian businessman corresponding with a US defence contractor regarding Eclipse materials, still intact, safely stored. The letter was never recovered, but the interception prompted renewed internal inquiries. One memo warned that continued investigation into Eclipse is inadvisable given political sensitivities concerning corporate complicity during the occupation period. There were, however, individuals who could not let the trail die. In 1987, a German journalist named Karin Weiss began investigating unmarked graves near Mittenwald, suspecting they were linked to a vanished SS logistics unit. During her research, she uncovered an elderly witness who recalled seeing strange trucks and men burning documents by the roadside in late April 1945. Days after the interview, Weiss's car was found abandoned outside Munich. Her research notes were never recovered. Police listed it as a voluntary disappearance. Privately, intelligence archivists viewed it differently. The Eclipse story intersects eerily with another anomaly, the ununearned materials list, a set of research inventories seized by American troops in 1945. These files detailed archaeological and scientific projects sponsored by Himmler's SS Institute. Among the missing entries is Project V7B, non-conventional propulsion prototype. Some researchers argue that Operation Eclipse was designed to transport the physical remnants of that project. Prototypes, research papers, perhaps even scientists. Others suggest it was less technological and more political. The transfer of wealth, gold, or incriminating corporate evidence that certain Allied companies preferred never to see daylight. The more one examines the available fragments, the clearer it becomes that Operation Eclipse was not a single mission, but a convergence of many interests as the Reich collapsed. German officers seeking immunity, industrial magnates preserving their investments, and foreign intelligence agencies all maneuvering within the chaos of Germany's final days. A convergence where documentation was deliberately erased, witnesses silenced, and official channels rendered unusable. The perfect storm for history to lose its trail. Modern investigators face an impenetrable wall of redactions. When German historian Lucas Bender filed a request in 2014 to review the British National Archives' Eclipse 45B microfilm, he was told the file had been reclassified indefinitely under Section 3 of the Freedom of Information Act for national security reasons. Section 3 is reserved for documents involving joint intelligence operations between NATO allies. Why a supposed Nazi convoy from 1945 would still qualify under that clause remains unexplained. The most unsettling clue lies not in Germany or Italy, but in Portugal. In 2001, during renovation of an old estate outside Lisbon, workers discovered a sealed metal container buried beneath the foundation. Inside were military maps, a rusted dog tag with the insignia of the Waffen-SS, and a small ledger written in English. The first page bore a typed heading, Property of Eclipse Division. The ledger contained names, some German, some English, and cryptic notations like P1 complete, C3 delivered, S2 never recovered. Portuguese authorities confiscated the materials, and within weeks, the items vanished into diplomatic custody. Each generation uncovers fragments, but the total picture remains buried, perhaps intentionally. Operation Eclipse is a ghost in the archives, a phantom convoy whose shadow runs parallel to the visible history of World War II. The deeper one digs, the more the timeline fractures, And the clearer it becomes that certain events of 1945 were never meant to be fully understood. Chapter 2. The Disappearance at Mittenwald. In early May 1945, as American patrols from the 10th Armored Division crossed into southern Bavaria, a string of civilian reports emerged around the small market town of Mittenwald. Locals spoke of soldiers in unfamiliar uniforms moving through the valley, disciplined, silent, carrying equipment that appeared neither German nor Allied. A few witnesses described vehicles without markings, their license plates freshly painted black. One farmer, Otto Senger, later told occupation authorities that the men had blocked the main road with a tank trap, detaining anyone who tried to approach. He remembered the insignia faintly visible beneath the new paint. A broken lightning bolt over a shield. The Americans logged his testimony and dismissed it as paranoia. The town's official war diary, recovered years later from Bavarian archives, confirms an unexplained nighttime disturbance on 29th of April. At approximately 0200 hours, mechanized columns were heard passing through the Obernach forest headed toward the Austrian border. The entry concludes with possible retreating SS logistics, yet no German units were registered operating in the region after that date. The convoy, believed to have consisted of 12 to 15 trucks, simply vanished into the Alps. 2 weeks later, when the US Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, began its systematic sweep of Bavaria, they stumbled across a shallow pit near the Isar River containing the remains of 5 men in German uniforms. All identification tags had been removed, but one body carried a pouch containing a fragment of a document. The partial heading read, Befehl Eclipse Transportstaffel. The discovery caused enough alarm that the file was immediately sealed under CIC Case 347B. The American report, still partially redacted, states, evidence suggests termination of own personnel to prevent compromise of ongoing asset relocation. Cargo location remains unknown. In 1948, during the Allied effort to consolidate intelligence materials in the Berlin Document Center, an archivist named Harold M. Schultz filed a memo referencing Eclipse Transportstaffel. The memo attached 2 photographs labeled Mittenwald, April 1945. Both images show a dirt road with tire tracks leading into dense woodland. The original negatives disappeared from the archive by 1950. When questioned years later, Schultz insisted that the photos depicted not trucks, but heavy trailers, like those used to carry laboratory equipment or machinery, as he described them. His written note in the margin added, one trailer had double shielding, possible radiation precautions. The shielding detail became pivotal decades later. Post-war debriefs of captured German scientists, especially those tied to nuclear research, often mentioned protective transport methods for sensitive materials, including thorium, uranium oxide, and mercury compounds used in prototype devices. If Operation Eclipse was responsible for moving such cargo, it might explain why both Allied and Soviet archives remained so selective about what was recorded. The Soviets were equally cautious. A 1946 NKVD document titled Material Extraction, Operations Southern Germany describes uncooperative. Western sectors concealing transport of atomic materials toward Mediterranean ports. The report was dismissed by Western historians as propaganda until fragments of matching terminology were discovered in British SIS microfilms. Category Schwartz, Cargo A, untraceable since May 1945. Mittenwald itself was never fully investigated. The US established temporary command in nearby Garmisch-Partenkirchen, converting the area into a rest station for the occupying troops. The forest became off-limits for months. Rumors spread among locals of American engineers digging near the river, removing metallic debris under tarpaulins. No official explanation was provided. Only one internal message dated June 1945 survives. Site secured. Artifacts removed to Bremerhaven for transit. What those artifacts were remains a blank entry in the manifest. In 1961, a former Wehrmacht driver named August Hoffner gave a sworn statement to a German television journalist. Hoffner claimed he had been assigned to drive one of the last convoys south under orders from a Colonel Ernst Bäumer, attached to SS Technical Branch 4. According to his account, they loaded sealed containers from an underground depot near Oberammergau. Bäumer informed them the cargo was vital to the survival of the Reich's scientific legacy. Hoffner described his route through Mittenwald, where one truck broke down, its cargo shifted, and the escorting officers grew nervous. Within hours, a second convoy arrived. Vehicles bearing blacked-out insignia and speaking English. Hoffner stated that his commanding officer ordered all men to abandon their trucks and flee east. He never saw the convoy again. 3 weeks later, he surrendered to US forces near Salzburg. His testimony, recorded on tape, was confiscated by German intelligence and has never been publicly released. Archival researchers who followed the Mittenwald trail discovered that several key witnesses died under curious circumstances. Major Robert H. Langley, the CIC officer who signed the 347B report, perished in a car accident in 1953 while en route to a debrief meeting in Frankfurt. 2 others assigned to the same case resigned and left military service within the same year. One later wrote privately to Langley's widow, confessing that we were warned off. Eclipse wasn't German anymore, it had sponsors. The notion of sponsorship has haunted every subsequent investigation. Declassified correspondence between US and British defense officials in 1958 refers cryptically to legacy holdings transferred under Eclipse. Jurisdiction. The memo does not define what these holdings were, but lists inspection restrictions at facilities under joint Anglo-American control. This timeframe overlaps with the early Cold War boom in aerospace research, nuclear propulsion, and experimental energy studies, fields that, according to historians, benefited heavily from post-war German technical data. If some of that knowledge bypassed official transfer programs, it might have arrived through darker channels. One peculiar thread emerged from Italy. In the archives of the Carabinieri Intelligence Unit lies an untranslated report filed in 1946. It mentions an unregistered vessel docking briefly in Genoa on the night of 2nd May, unloading several heavy crates before vanishing out to sea. Witnesses claimed the men on board spoke both German and English. The report identifies the ship as Argento and includes a note referencing Eclipse delivery. Whether coincidence or confirmation, it aligns precisely with the missing segment of the Mittenwald Trail. By the early 1980s, Operation Eclipse had become legend among military archivists, an emblem of wartime ambiguity. But then a new find rekindled its reality. In 1984, during excavation near the Austrian border for a new roadway, construction workers unearthed fragments of metallic tubing and 2 decayed crates containing sealed glass cylinders. Radiation measurements taken by Austrian authorities indicated residual contamination. Within days, the site was sealed, the materials removed by men claiming affiliation with NATO Environmental Services. When local journalists requested the official report, it was marked classified under international jurisdiction. At the same time, researchers noticed subtle deletions in digital versions of US National Archives inventories. The term Eclipse was removed from several WWII logistics indexes between 1983 and 1987. Officials cited data consolidation. The deletions coincided with the death of a British historian, Colonel John Wilkes, who had petitioned for declassification of Eclipse-related records. His notes, later recovered from his residence, contained the line, "Mittenwald not the origin, but the exchange point. If true, Mittenwald was merely the handoff, a rendezvous where the Reich delivered its final secrets not to save itself, but to purchase survival through cooperation." In this interpretation, Operation Eclipse represents the moment where enemy and victor blurred into one, trading intelligence for immunity and rewriting the narrative of post-war justice. Each missing crate, each redacted file, each erased photograph whispers that truth may have been buried in the Alps alongside those 5 nameless men. Today, Mittenwald remains a quiet tourist town surrounded by scenic peaks. Yet every spring thaw exposes new soil layers, and hikers occasionally find rusted shell casings, broken tools, or scorched fragments of steel. Locals still recall the night when engines rumbled through the dark and then stopped forever in the forest. The question persists in military circles and historical forums alike. What exactly departed Bavaria that night, and who was waiting for it on the other side of the mountains? Until the sealed archives open, and if they ever do, the convoy of Operation Eclipse will remain a silent procession in the fog of Europe's forgotten war. Chapter 3. The Genoa Connection Uncovered. By late spring of 1945, northern Italy had become a labyrinth of collapsing fronts, shifting allegiances, and black market channels exploited by retreating German officers. Genoa, still recovering from years of Allied bombing, was in chaos. The port was formally liberated on April 26th, But even before the official surrender, warehouses were being looted, docks commandeered, and records destroyed. In that confusion, it was easy for something or someone to disappear. It was into this fractured landscape that Operation Eclipse appears to have made its final stop. The first substantial evidence linking the Bavarian convoy to Genoa surfaced in a declassified 1952 British SIS memorandum titled Southern Exfiltration Routes, Germany-Italy. The report, composed by field analyst R. H. Donovan, describes a series of unmarked transports, possibly connected to remnants of German scientific research divisions, travelling south through the Brenner Pass between April 27 and 30, 1945. Donovan's team tracked freight consistent with laboratory equipment and sealed containers, headed toward the Ligurian coast, escorted by German-speaking personnel in civilian attire. In the margins of the report appears a handwritten note. Eclipse cargo, probable maritime transfer via Genoa, Objekten Weiss. That codename, Objekten Weiss, is the only consistent phrase appearing in both British and Soviet documentation concerning the mysterious shipments. Soviet intelligence decrypted a similar phrase from a captured Enigma fragment in 1945, Objekt Weiss, freigegeben für Transit. Its literal translation, Object White cleared for transit, suggests a classification label rather than a name. What white meant in that context remains unclear, though several wartime logistics systems used color codes for research categories: blue for biological, red for chemical, white for experimental physics. If accurate, it may indicate the convoy's cargo was tied to Germany's most advanced physical sciences programs, possibly nuclear or propulsion-related research. In 1946, Italian port authorities discovered incomplete customs manifests dated May 2nd. One document, stamped Ufficio Doganale di Genova, lists a vessel departing without inspection under diplomatic exemption. The space for nation of registry was left blank, the captain's signature indecipherable. A dock worker's oral testimony recorded decades later described 12 to 15 large wooden crates being loaded overnight under supervision of men who spoke English and German interchangeably. When asked about uniforms, he recalled only that the guards wore armbands bearing a white circle with a dark central symbol, something he couldn't identify. The following morning, the ship was gone. By the 1950s, the Argento file had become a rumor whispered within naval circles. Officially, no Allied or Axis vessel by that name was registered at Genoa or any Mediterranean port during that period. However, British Admiralty records declassified in 1989 reveal that a ship bearing a similar profile, a small freighter named Yves SS Argon, was seized by US forces in 1943 and subsequently leased to private contractors under foreign charter. Its logs cease in April 1945, the same week the Eclipse convoy was last sighted. The chartering company, Halberd Shipping Limited, was a British corporate shell that dissolved 6 months later. Investigators tracing its paperwork found its directors linked to known intelligence intermediaries involved in Operation Paperclip extractions. The Americans too left breadcrumbs. A debrief report from the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, dated June 1945 refers obliquely to high-value scientific cargo believed transferred via neutral vessel to Iberian destination. It never names the operation but mentions assets exfiltrated outside European theatre control. One analyst later annotated the report in pencil. Post-Eclipse continuity, check Lisbon contacts. That single remark would spark decades of speculation that the Genoa cargo never reached Allied command but instead passed into private or semi-official custody in Portugal, then a haven for both fugitives and intelligence brokers. Lisbon's wartime neutrality had already made it the crossroads of espionage. As the Reich disintegrated, its agents, bankers and scientists flooded the city, seeking passage to South America or protection under false identities. Among the diplomatic cables exchanged between London and Washington in mid-1945 are references to incoming scientific delegations under corporate auspices, particularly in aviation and metallurgy. Many were absorbed into legitimate post-war research contracts. Yet one cable, marked Eyes Only Prime Minister, contains a striking line. Arrivals linked to Eclipse network confirmed, advise discretion, political risk extreme. The authenticity of that cable remains debated, but its provenance traces back to the British Embassy in Lisbon. In 1957, the Portuguese secret police, PIDE, quietly detained a German national named Karl Werner Bäumer, allegedly using the alias Karl Baum. Bäumer had been an SS officer in the Technical Division 4, the same name mentioned by August Hoffner years earlier as his commanding officer during the Mittenwald convoy. When questioned, Bäumer admitted transporting sealed equipment on orders of the Reich Main Office for Armament. He refused to identify the cargo's destination, insisting it had been handed over to English-speaking officials who were not military. Within a week, he was released without charge and disappeared from Portugal. The official PIDE interrogation record, smuggled to France decades later, carries one enigmatic phrase in its summary. Subject linked to Eclipse file. Status transferred to NATO. The trail through Genoa, therefore, ends not in confirmed evidence, but in layers of overlapping deniability. Yet certain consistencies persist. The number of vehicles, the direction of travel, and the repeated intersection with Anglo-American intelligence figures operating outside formal military oversight. When historians from the University of Munich attempted to cross-reference shipping insurance archives in 1999, they uncovered a post-war claim filed by a London firm for loss of cargo, classified components, Mediterranean route, May 1945. The claim referenced the insurer's code ECL12, likely shorthand for Eclipse. Payment was authorised by the British Treasury in 1946. One of the few contemporary eyewitnesses still alive in the 1970s, Italian port engineer Giacomo Lorusso described what he saw that night in Genoa during a BBC interview. The cargo boxes were not wooden, at least not entirely. They had metal seams, riveted like aircraft fuselage. The men moving them wore gloves and masks, as if the contents were dangerous. They loaded quickly, without words. There were soldiers who looked American, but their rifles were German. When it was over, a man in a black coat gave us money and told us to forget we ever worked there. Lorusso died less than a year later. Investigators analysing the few surviving. Eclipse documents note a consistent pattern of post-war suppression. Whenever the trail reached Genoa or Lisbon, files either vanished or were reclassified under transnational defence agreements. Requests under Britain's Freedom of Information Act have been met with identical language. Release would compromise national security interests. Even US National Archives inventories show missing folders in the paperclip series corresponding to the same time frame. Modern forensic researchers have attempted to track physical traces through environmental sampling. In 2008, a joint Italian-German expedition conducted deep sonar scans near Genoa's harbour, searching for submerged wreckage matching wartime freighters. They discovered an anomaly approximately 2.4 nautical miles offshore, a metallic structure resting 180 metres below sea level, dimensions consistent with a small cargo ship. Subsequent dives were halted when Italian naval authorities intervened, citing unexploded ordnance hazard. The area was declared restricted. No further exploration was allowed. The team's preliminary report was confiscated, though one anonymous researcher later described seeing cargo containers still intact, with stenciled symbols resembling Allied supply codes. Every trace of the Genoa connection seems to end in silence, sealed either by secrecy or the sea itself. What little remains, dock records, witness accounts, insurance claims, paints a pattern of deliberate obfuscation. To the few intelligence historians who still pursue the case, Operation Eclipse represents the shadow intersection of wartime desperation and post-war opportunity, where moral boundaries dissolved under the weight of technological ambition. Whatever those trucks carried south from Bavaria, whatever was sealed within those metal crates, it was valuable enough for nations to rewrite their own histories to conceal it. If the convoy indeed reached Genoa, and if Argento or Argent sailed as suspected, then somewhere between the Ligurian coast and Lisbon lies the final chapter of Operation Eclipse. Whether it ended in the cold depths of the Mediterranean or in the vault of a foreign power, no one can say. What is certain is that after May 1945, all surviving references to Eclipse cease. No returning personnel, no captured records, no public accounting, only silence, and a few fading names buried in archives stamped permanent retention, do not release. Chapter 4. The Lisbon Ledger and the Missing Names. The trail of Operation Eclipse reaches its most tangible yet unsettling point, not in Germany or Italy, but on the western edge of Europe. Lisbon in 1945 was the last neutral gateway for those fleeing a dying Reich. Within its labyrinth of consulates, banks, and expatriate hotels, Allied and Axis agents brushed shoulders daily. It was here, according to several fragmentary documents, that the Eclipse network resurfaced, briefly before vanishing into the opaque folds of post-war intelligence. The earliest clue comes from a 1945 US Navy decrypt, an encoded transmission from OSS field officer John T. Marwick to Washington. The decrypted text, released only in part, reads, "Contact with source Mercury, established stop received materials, referred to as Eclipse files. Stop items in hand include technical manifests and ledger. Stop handover in Lisbon imminent. The ledger, if it existed, has never been found in American archives." Marwick was reassigned to Madrid that same month and later died in a plane crash en route to Tangier. His Lisbon station diary, like so many Eclipse artifacts, was lost due to humidity damage. Post-war Portuguese police archives indicate that between May and June 1945, several unidentified crates arrived at the private docks near Alcantara under diplomatic protection from the British Embassy. The documentation lists the shipment as scientific materials, property of Eclipse Division. The term Eclipse Division had never appeared in any known Allied organization, yet it was written in English, not German. Portuguese customs officer Luis Pereira, whose logbook later surfaced in the 1970s, noted in his own handwriting, "Strange cargo, officers insisted it not be inspected. One box, smaller than the others, had a radiation symbol and foreign serial numbers." His report was filed away and forgotten for 30 years. In 2001, construction workers unearthed what may have been part of that shipment's trail. Beneath the ruins of an old coastal estate outside Lisbon, they discovered a sealed metal container buried under concrete. Inside were rotted papers, 2 corroded metal cylinders, and a small black notebook. The notebook was written in English and bore the embossed words, "Property of Eclipse Division." Though its contents were partially destroyed, Portuguese military archivists managed to transcribe several legible pages. The entries listed names: Dr. R. L. Haldane, H. von Richter, C. Baum, and Agent 12A. Next to each were notations such as P1 complete, C3 delivered, and S2 never recovered. Analysts concluded these corresponded to project or cargo designations, yet no known wartime file correlates with these codes. The notebook and cylinders were quietly transferred to the custody of NATO's Joint Intelligence Committee and have not been displayed since. Lisbon's diplomatic community of 1945 was a maze of espionage. British SIS, American OSS, and remnants of the Abwehr each maintain networks of informants trading in both secrets and passage papers. One surviving memo from the British ambassador Sir Ronald Campbell to London, dated May 18, 1945, states, "The Eclipse cargo has arrived safely under neutral flag, arrangements proceeding for scientific custody per prior agreement." This single sentence remains one of the few official acknowledgements that something known as Eclipse was handled through diplomatic channels. Yet when historians requested the documents supporting attachments, they were told those pages were lost during wartime transfer. By the 1950s, Lisbon had evolved from a wartime refuge into a Cold War staging ground. Former German scientists, financiers, and intelligence brokers operated freely under new identities, many connected to industrial projects in the Americas and South Africa. The Portuguese secret police, PID, kept close watch, but often deferred to NATO allies when foreigners were involved. It was during one such surveillance in 1957 that PD encountered a familiar name: Karl Werner Bäumer, the SS officer previously tied to the Mittenwald transport. Using the alias Karl Baum, he had registered with the German Chamber of Commerce in Lisbon and maintained frequent contact with 2 British nationals associated with aerospace contracting firms. The PID interrogation record, partially leaked in 1974, includes a terse summary. Subject transported classified German materials 1945, delivered to English officers, now under protection. The last line is underlined twice. Subject linked to Eclipse file. Status transferred to NATO. Independent researchers who obtained copies of the record noticed that the phrase "status transferred to NATO" appeared to have been added later, possibly in a different typewriter. Still, its presence suggested Eclipse had not merely vanished into post-war myth, but had been absorbed into official frameworks. That claim gained further traction in 1963, when declassified CIA correspondence mentioned Eclipse assets pending review for relocation. The files offer no detail but coincide chronologically with the heightened tensions of the Cold War's nuclear and aerospace arms race. Among the few scholars allowed access to the Portuguese archives in the 1990s was Dr. Helena Duarte, a historian specializing in wartime intelligence trafficking. Duarte uncovered correspondence between a defunct Lisbon bank, Banco da Fé, and a London-based trust known as Grayson & Co. The letters referenced continued maintenance payments for Eclipse personnel extending into the early 1950s. The accounts, opened under British diplomatic credentials, were closed in 1954. When she attempted to publish her findings, Duarte received an official notice warning that certain historical materials remain restricted under defense cooperation agreements. She abandoned the project soon after and refused further interviews. Today, a few digital photographs survive of the Lisbon ledger discovered in 2001. They show a faint grid of names and codes typed in faded ink. One column is titled Transit Sequence, another Custody. The last page ends abruptly with a single line. Eclipse terminated. Assets distributed per protocol. The handwriting beneath, almost illegible, reads, "We are ghosts now." The significance of that final note continues to divide historians. Some interpret it as the dying words of a disillusioned operative. Others see it as confirmation that Eclipse became a network absorbed by the emerging Western intelligence alliance, its members protected and its discoveries folded into classified research. Several of the surnames in the ledger correspond to scientists later identified with early Cold War projects in propulsion and advanced materials. Their presence in Portugal, a neutral sanctuary, would have facilitated quiet transfer to nations seeking technological advantage without the public controversy of direct Nazi collaboration. To this day, official Portuguese statements acknowledge only that an unidentified container was recovered near Lisbon in 2001 and later removed for analysis by Allied authorities. The exact location remains undisclosed. Journalists who have attempted to locate the estate site describe being approached by plainclothes officials warning them to cease inquiry. One filmmaker, Carlos Viana, who began a documentary on the subject in 2003, vanished during a research trip to Geneva. His unfinished footage, later recovered, includes a final recorded message. "I think I found the real ledger. There are more names than anyone suspects." This goes beyond 1945. Lisbon remains the last verifiable waypoint of Operation Eclipse. It represents the moment when the remnants of a defeated empire's secrets crossed into the bloodstream of a new world order, rebranded under layers of legitimacy. Somewhere within NATO's sealed vaults, the Lisbon ledger, or its duplicate, may still exist, a relic of a transaction that blurred the line between victory and complicity. Until those archives are opened, the story of Eclipse endures as one of the Cold War's most persistent ghosts, proof that even in peace, the machinery of secrecy never stopped turning. Chapter 5. The Hidden Custodians of Eclipse. By the early years of the Cold War, Operation Eclipse had faded from public record, but deep inside the architecture of Western intelligence, its fingerprints remained. Between 1947 and 1952, a series of unacknowledged defense initiatives surfaced across Britain, the United States, and Portugal, projects connected by identical administrative codes, ECL-12, ECLR, and ECLS. None of these projects were tied to any official wartime agency. Later audit reports, released only under pressure in the 1970s, referred to them collectively as legacy accounts, scientific retention programs. The phrasing was bureaucratic, but behind it hid a network of scientists, engineers, and handlers, men who had crossed moral lines in 1945 and been quietly folded into a new power structure. An internal British Ministry of Supply memorandum dated 1950, recovered accidentally during a parliamentary inquiry decades later, records a conversation between intelligence officers regarding continued coordination with Eclipse staff. The phrase Eclipse staff appears nowhere else in official literature. The note reads, "Assets relocated to Iberian Peninsula for security. Oversight transferred to NATO Scientific Liaison." At the bottom, someone had scribbled in pencil, "Baumann Richter retained. Haldane missing." Those names, lifted from the Lisbon ledger discovered half a century later, confirmed that the ministry still maintained a direct awareness of Eclipse. Personnel long after the war's end. Dr. Rudolf von Richter was an aeronautical physicist once attached to Germany's Luftfahrtforschungsanstalt Braunschweig, responsible for high-speed turbine research. Officially, he was captured by the Americans in 1945 and resettled under Operation Paperclip. Yet shipping manifests from 1946 show he boarded a vessel departing Lisbon, not Bremen, travelling under a British-issued passport. In the US, he later joined an experimental propulsion division of a private defense contractor, working under government secrecy until his death in 1962. His personnel file contains a sealed addendum labelled Eclipse 01 Clearance. No one outside of intelligence circles has ever viewed it. Haldane's identity is even murkier. The Lisbon ledger lists Dr. R. L. Haldane as one of the completed entries. British archives record no scientist by that name during or after the war, though a Robert L. Haldane appears in declassified CIA payroll logs from 1953 as a technical consultant. Classified energy research. Attempts to cross-reference the file result in missing pages and reclassified sections. When one historian pressed for access in 2007, the National Archives replied, "File ECL-RL 57 not located, believed to have been destroyed in compliance with NATO Directive 5012. The directive itself, concerning covert historical integration of inherited personnel, remains classified to this day." In 1961, a curious internal scandal within NATO briefly pulled Eclipse back into the shadows of official attention. A top-secret review of legacy funding discrepancies uncovered unexplained transfers totaling several £1 million flowing into a private foundation registered in Zurich under the name Institute Weiss. The funds were traced to defense accounts connected with research on gravitational field modulation, a fringe topic at the time. A handwritten annotation in the audit file states, "Origin, Eclipse Division, Lisbon." When the investigators pressed for clarification, the inquiry was abruptly shut down and all associated documentation sealed under national security provisions. One of the auditors later remarked privately that it was like touching a live wire that no one wanted to admit existed. By the 1970s, aging Cold War veterans began to speak in cautious fragments about the old network, a cadre of post-war scientists and handlers who operated without borders, answering not to governments but to an unspoken alliance of necessity. Former CIA analyst Peter Drummond, in an unpublished memoir discovered after his death, described meeting an Eclipse representative in London in 1968. The man, identified only as AR, claimed to manage legacy personnel placements across Europe and the US aerospace industry. Drummond wrote, "He said the program began as a safeguard, keeping knowledge from falling into the wrong hands, but somewhere along the way, it stopped serving any flag." The most tangible evidence of Eclipse's endurance lies within the defense infrastructure itself. A 1982 declassification request revealed that the British Defense Evaluation and Research Agency still maintained budget entries coded ECL support through the 1970s, officially tied to materials analysis and propulsion data retention. The amounts were small, mere shadows in ledgers, but they persisted for decades, suggesting an institutional reluctance to close accounts tied to unknown origins. When journalists investigated, officials claimed the acronym referred to Environmental Calibration Laboratory, yet internal memos show the term used, inconsistently and often accompanied by handwritten warnings like "do not merge with standard records, sensitive." Then, in 1998, a startling discovery reignited interest. A retired archivist from the Bundesnachrichtendienst, BND, Germany's Federal Intelligence Service, leaked a photocopy of a memorandum dated 1956 from NATO's Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe. It referred to Operation Eclipse, integration status and non-disclosure of prior scientific custody agreements. The document confirmed that Eclipse, materials, and likely personnel had been absorbed under NATO administration, protected by multinational secrecy clauses. The memo's authenticity was quietly confirmed by two independent historians, but was never publicly acknowledged by any government. Over time, stories of Eclipse evolved into academic legend, a symbol of post-war pragmatism and ethical compromise. Yet even legends cast real shadows. In 2011, an Italian researcher, Matteo Rea, stumbled upon declassified shipping correspondence from 1947 between Lisbon and a private Portuguese aeronautics firm. The letters referenced Eclipse components being transferred to American custody per 1945 agreement. When Rea sought further clarification, the documents vanished from the archive within weeks. Officials later claimed they were temporarily removed for restoration. They have never been returned. Within the intelligence community, whispers of an Eclipse continuation group persisted into the early 2000s. Described as a dormant committee overseeing classified legacy materials across multiple NATO member states. None of its members have ever been named, and its meeting records remain sealed. The possibility that these individuals, or their successors, still guard the remnants of Operation Eclipse remains one of modern Europe's least acknowledged open secrets. Historians attempting to piece together Eclipse's fate face an intricate web of obstruction. Whenever documentation surfaces, it carries the same signs of careful curation: missing pages, false identifiers, unexplained burn marks on microfilm copies. The consistent pattern suggests not carelessness but intent. Somewhere within those erasures lies the truth of what was taken from Bavaria in April 1945, what sailed from Genoa, and what surfaced in Lisbon under a neutral flag. The possibility that it was technology, perhaps nuclear, perhaps experimental propulsion, cannot be dismissed. Nor can the darker theory that Eclipse's true cargo was human: scientists, financiers, and ideologues whose knowledge and influence would quietly shape post-war power structures under new names. In an interview conducted shortly before his death, former British intelligence officer Major Thomas Penfold described Eclipse in unsettling terms. It wasn't a convoy. It was a covenant, a promise between victors and vanquished that certain knowledge would never die, no matter who won the war. His words, dismissed by some as the ramblings of an old man, nevertheless encapsulate the essence of what makes Operation Eclipse so haunting. The idea that the war ended publicly in 1945 but continued in silence behind laboratory doors, in vaults, and in the ink of reclassified ledgers. To this day, when researchers file requests under NATO's historical archives, entries linked to ECL codes return the same answer: record retained for reasons of mutual defense. It is a phrase deliberately constructed to reveal nothing. Somewhere within that bureaucratic phrasing hides the reality of a network that outlived the Reich, outlasted the Cold War, and perhaps in some unseen form still exists, guarded by those who inherited the duty to keep Eclipse in the dark. In every surviving fragment of Operation Eclipse, one theme persists: the deliberate absence of closure. From the convoys in the Bavarian forests to the Lisbon ledger and the silent custodians that followed, the record always ends mid-sentence, as if someone intentionally closed the file before the final line could be written. The last known Eclipse reference, dated 1987, reads only, "Custody confirmed. Archive to remain sealed until re-evaluation of global stability. No signature, no insignia." It suggests a secret waiting for the right conditions to surface, or to be erased entirely. Somewhere beneath the weight of 70 years of classified history, the trucks of Operation Eclipse still move through the fog, their cargo untouched, their purpose unresolved, their shadow stretching quietly into the modern age.